Hello, my name is Leela, and I am one half of Now What Pottery Works, and today I am going to show you how I throw my traditional mug shape. I throw them using between a pound and a quarter of clay, and I wedge it first before getting it attached to my wheel head, where I kind of pat it down into place to make sure it's really attached. And then I'm throwing on a kick wheel, so I have to get my wheel up to speed, and you see me doing that here. I'm kicking it with my right leg, trying to get it as fast as I'd like it. Once my wheel is going the speed that I'd like, I can then start centering my clay. To do that, I'm going to get the clay and my hands wet, and then I'm going to apply pressure with the base of my left palm towards center, and then the spot where my fingers connect to my hand on my right, I'm going to meet that pressure, and doing that will make the clay rise up in between my fingers, making a little cone. I really like to cone my clay fairly tall. I find that it helps me center a lot more easily. Next, I cone my clay down using my left hand up near the top and my right going over the top of the cone, pushing my clay slightly away from center as I push down and in with both hands. And you'll see the clay moves down into kind of a little puck shape. Sometimes the clay won't be quite centered yet, and you can repeat the coning steps as many times as you need to get it more on center, but this time my puck was really centered right off the bat. Using the slip that was on my hands and a little bit more water, I refine the shape just a little bit more to make sure it's perfectly centered before I start opening the center of the clay. I'm aiming for kind of a soft U shape so that I have room to get my hands onto the inside of the puck and start making my pulls. And at the same time as I am opening, I'm also widening the base of my pot, which I want to have a round bottom so that it is really easy to clean since my mugs are typically pretty tall. I move right into pulling my walls, which I do by using my right hand to push in from the outside and my left hand to push against that on the inside, and then slowly sliding my hands up the lip of the pot. And then once I reach the top, I kind of stop, let go, and make sure I press down on the lip just a little to keep it in line. My next pull, I use my fingertips instead and make a little bit more of a divot, pushing in from the outside and out from the inside to carefully lift that clay all the way up. My pulls are typically pretty quick and easy, and I try to make as few pulls per pot as I can because I feel like I can pretty easily overwork the clay if I try to make too many pulls all on the same piece. I typically prefer to use slip that is made while I'm throwing rather than just plain water, so you often see me stop to apply more slip to my pot so I can make the next pull. With this pull, I also start doing some shaping. So as I am making my pull, I'm going to be pushing at first a little bit harder from the inside, allowing my hand to kind of move the pot outward. And about halfway up the pot, I'm going to stop and switch that pressure to being more coming from the outside than coming from the inside, which will keep the lip of the mug a little bit straighter. I'll also compress the lip just a little bit here to make sure that it stays on center and not too thin. It's really easy to pull the lip of a pot a little bit too thin to be comfortable, and I really want to make sure that doesn't happen. I next grab my rib to finish shaping the inside, and I'm just going to stick my hand inside the mug and press out along the same side I was making my pulls on with my rib to make that bottom corner more rounded. This often kind of makes the upper top part of the mug a little bit wider than I want, so I may collar in the top using a little bit of extra water to make sure that it doesn't flare out. Before I collar though, I'm going to make sure there's no water at the bottom of the mug, and I even sometimes use this kind of special tool that my husband made for me that's got a rounded corner to really make sure the bottom of the mug is really nice. It's really hard to get in there after I bring the lip of the mug a little bit more narrow, so it's always better for me to finish this now than it is to have to go back later. Once I finish all of that, I'll finally collar in the lip, which I do first by getting the mug wet, and then I basically give the top part of my pot a little hug. I may even go back in and make another little pull like I'm doing here to help thin it out, because every time you collar a pot, you make the walls just a little bit thicker. I also pay really close attention to the lip at every stage because that's the part your mouth is going to interact with, so I want it to be really comfortable and turn out perfectly. Managed to get a little bit more water into the bottom of the mug, so I remove that, collar in the pot just a tiny bit more, and then I use my metal rib to finish refining the outside shape. I take off any extra clay that's down there at the bottom, that's called the skirt, and then carefully press the surface of the rib against my mug, trying not to change the shape much until I get partway up, but using it to remove any slip that is on the mug, and then one last time, refine the lip. I'm basically done with all of the throwing steps now, but I need to get the pot off of the wheel. Since I prefer to throw my pots directly on the wheel head, that means I either need to slide them off or pick them directly up off of the wheel head, and I typically prefer to just pick them up. To do that, my hands need to be both clean and really dry, and so does the outside surface of my mug, which is what I did with my rib in that last step. Once my hands are clean and dry, I will take my wire tool, carefully run it underneath the pot, dry my hands one last time, and then very lightly, using as little pressure as I can, I'm going to let my hands just kind of stick to the surface of the mug a little, carefully lift and move the pot off the wheel. The mug will then sit and dry for a couple of days or until it is something called leather hard. Leather hard is the perfect consistency to trim, where I can squeeze the bottom of the pot and it doesn't really deform, but it cuts really easily with my fingernail. Trimming is the process of removing any extra clay from the base of the mug so you can form what's called a foot. To be able to do that, I need to get the mug recentered on the wheel with the lip facing down, so the bottom of the mug is now what we're working on. There are tons of different ways to recenter your pot, all of which I'll go over in future videos, but for now we're just going to get the mug centered, and then I'm going to take what's called lugs, which are just pieces of clay that I roll out and use to attach my piece to the wheel. I'm pressing down at about a 45-degree angle so that I'm mostly attaching them to the wheel and not the lip of my pot, and I don't want to smear them onto the pot and make them stick. They're really just there to hold the piece, keep it from wobbling while I apply pressure using my trimming tools. Once my piece is attached, I then need to get my wheel spinning faster than I did while I was throwing. I find that I like to trim with my wheel going pretty fast because the spirals fly off so much better. Trimming is one of my favorite parts of the process because the spirals are so satisfying. I mean, look at them just fly off of the pot. What I'm doing here is making sure that the foot looks the way I want. So I'm bringing the bottom of the mug in a little so that it kind of tapers a bit. And I like to put a foot that you can really hold on to on a mug. There's a few reasons for this. I really like to have a foot that I can hold onto while I'm glazing. It makes the glazing process a lot easier since I typically dip my mugs lip first into the glaze, so I'm holding onto that foot. The other reason the foot can be really nice is if you hand wash your dishes, because it gives you another spot to hold onto the mug and not have to worry about dropping it in your sink. I try to throw my pots so that I really only need to trim the very bottom of them, kind of the bottom inch rather than the whole side, but I do often do a little bit of cleanup just past that point to make sure that where I'm trimming blends nicely into the rest of the mug. And here I'm using my trimming tool to really dig in about a centimeter down from the edge of the mug, making sure I can establish that deep foot I've already talked about. And I think this is when the spirals get to be the most fun. It's really easy to get distracted when you're trimming and have the spirals be something you focus on rather than how thick the walls of your pot are. And that can lead to disaster because it's really easy to trim through the wall of your pot at this point if you're not paying attention to how thick your pot is and get too distracted by the lovely spirals. I've definitely done that a number of times before, and pretty much any potter has, because it's really, really easy to have those spirals kind of just take over your brain and get a little too distracted. It's really important to finish trimming the entire outside of your mug if you're going to do that before you move on to trimming the inside part of the foot. That way, if you change your mind about how thick you want the foot to be, you don't accidentally trim off the foot, which is a really common thing I see beginners do. So please make sure you finish trimming the outside first, and then you can move on to trimming the inside of the foot. I also want to avoid any super sharp corners, so I typically will touch up just the very edge of where I started trimming to make sure that I don't have any spots that are really easy to chip through daily use. I want my mugs to be something you can use for many years to come and not have them break pretty quickly after you buy them. So I'm always paying close attention to the spots where the mug is going to interact with your mouth or interact with the table. I then trim out the bottom inside of the mug, and this is so that the pot is the same thickness throughout. It's common to leave a little bit of extra clay down there. It allows you to make sure the mug is the shape you're aiming for and allows it to support itself a little bit better. And this foot that you can trim in makes the pot feel a little bit lighter and a little more balanced. If you don't remove enough clay from those spots, sometimes you can get something called an S-crack, which is where the pot dries unevenly and you get what looks like a little S at the bottom of your mug that can go all the way through the pot. S-cracks aren't something you can easily fix either. Typically, once they happen, you have to reclaim the clay. Otherwise, you're always going to have a little tiny crack at the bottom of your pot. So this is an easy way to avoid that and just make sure your pots are all the same consistency throughout. I often do touch up just a teeny bit on the outside, which I tell my students not to do, but I can kind of tell how thick something is when I tap on it, which you see me doing on occasion, and I could tell that the sides had just a little bit more to trim. I'm done trimming this pot at this point, and I'm just going to use my sponge to carefully smooth over the foot and any other lines that popped up because I want the outside of the mug to be extra smooth and soft. You can see me doing that tapping thing right here. I'm listening and feeling for the bounce of that. It's kind of like tapping on a drum, and it can let me know exactly how thick the piece is. Here, it was letting me know there was a teeny bit more clay at the bottom that I could remove. So even though I've already smoothed the foot, I chose to come in and take just a little bit more clay off of the base. After I'm finished trimming, there are still a bunch more steps that go into making a mug, and sometimes I do them in slightly different orders. Sometimes I pull the handles before I put the mug on the wheel to trim, and sometimes I do it after. In this case, I'm showing you the handle pulling after the mug trimming. If I choose to do it this way, I'll then put the mugs inside a damp box or even just a little plastic tote with a lid so I can hold them at the correct consistency, because when attaching your mugs to their handles, they need to be the same consistency or the handle will just crack right off. I first have to make the handles before I can attach them, and this is done through the process of pulling a handle. Now, this process is kind of funny. I am taking a wet kind of carrot of clay and quickly sliding my hand down the length of the handle. This makes the handle get longer. I'm squeezing just a little bit, putting fairly even pressure on it. If you squeeze too unevenly, you can kind of create little wrinkles or divots in your handle, and you don't want that, then they won't be very smooth to hold. I then do a little bit of like shaping on the handle using my thumb, kind of flip the handle over and let it sit and dry until it's leather hard. If I make a bunch of handles at once and have a bunch of them to attach, I'll then carefully load them into one of my totes, making sure they're all fairly close and touching once they're the appropriate dryness. This allows me to batch make pots rather than just making one at a time, which makes the process a lot less time consuming. You can see I have a couple of different kinds of handles here, but I'm storing them all together in this one box. This gives me a little bit more time so that the handles don't dry out while I'm attaching them to the other pots, or I can even pull my handles on a different day than I'm going to attach them, which is not something I recommend if you're just making one pot. Now we can attach one of those handles to this mug, and I'm just going to pull one of my longer, flatter ones out of the box and kind of line it up and measure it so that I can see how much of that handle length I need. I typically spend quite a bit of time making sure the handle fit is just right, because the handle is what makes or breaks a mug. Everyone has their own preferences for handles and mugs, but my favorite kind of handles are these wider, flat ones. I find them to be the most comfortable, particularly on mugs like mine that often hold about 20 ounces of liquid. And since everyone has their own preferences for how they hold a mug, for me, I like to be able to grip all the way around the mug, kind of having the handle go over all four fingers, and I'm almost hugging the mug. Of course, you can hold them in any number of ways, but I find that I'm aiming to have them be most comfortable when you have a lot of liquid in them, and since I like to take my mugs places with me and carry them around, I like to have that narrow opening so that less liquid splashes around as you use them. I also don't want them to be so long they hang off the edge of the mug, so I'll typically trim the bottom to make sure they're the right length. I'll also kind of press the handle into the table a little right where I want it to attach to the mug to thin it out there just a little bit before mock fitting it onto the mug. There's no scoring or slipping here yet. I'm just kind of trying to figure out if the length is correct, if I like the proportions, if it lines up the way I want. Did I get the shape quite right? And typically spend a couple of minutes just looking at this, kind of turning the mug around, rocking it back and forth, seeing what I think. And once I decide, I will mark out the spots where my handle is going to sit and then score and slip those spots using my needle tool. Scoring and slipping is just the process of scratching and then adding liquid clay or slip to make sure that your handle isn't going to come off. So you'll do this on both the mug and the handle where they touch. This is a process you have to do anytime you want to attach leather hard clay to other leather hard clay. It won't just stick, so you need to add a bit of surface texture and a little bit of liquid to get them to stick together. I find that I really want to make sure my handles are attached well, especially since I intend these to be something you can carry with you. I want to make sure the handles are on really well, so lots of slip, lots of scoring, and being very careful to line them up and blend the handles in well. I also really prefer my handles to kind of look like they're growing out of the mug, so I'm going to blend away any of the edges. There's going to be no defined spot where the handle actually attaches to the mug in either spot. I typically like to start with a bit of a tapping motion to start blending the clay together. That tapping just kind of presses the clay a little bit, and then I can smooth it down and change the shape if I'd like, but the tapping keeps my fingers a little bit drier, and then the blending is a little bit easier. I will typically spend a good 2 to 4 minutes blending my handles out the first time to make sure they're attached as well as they can be, and then I will typically clean them up again after the mug reaches its leather hard or drier end of leather hard stage. I also really like to take a blending tool or a sculpting tool and get in between the crevice of the handle and the mug body and make sure that there's not too much extra slip there. Otherwise, you can kind of see it later, and I want this to be a spot that your fingers interact with, so I don't want any rough bumps where you can kind of feel that later. That's basically the entire process of how I make my mug bodies. There's a little bit more fiddling with the handles later, making sure they don't crack. I'll go over that surface with a kind of metal tool. I typically actually use a vintage aluminum knitting needle to smooth those spots out after the mug is a little bit more dry. But at this point, that's basically a finished mug. So thank you all so much for watching these. It's been a while since I have made any long form content, and I won't lie, recording these voiceovers is always way harder than I expect it to be. I'm perfectly comfortable making the short form ones, but for some reason, these long form videos are so intimidating. So I hope you enjoyed watching. There will be more videos to come as soon as I can get those recorded, because I've been filming for you a ton lately. So if you watched, thanks so much for watching, and I appreciate you all. If there are any other parts of the process you would like to see, let me know in the comments so I can make the videos that you are interested in, and I'll talk to you soon.